Motherhood is all-consuming.
Having babies, nursing, feeling the fear of loving someone that much.
And there's this baby on your chest, and boom, your entire life has changed.
It's a privilege of being your child's safest space and watching your heart walk around outside of your body.
The truth is, I can be having the best time being a mum 1 minute, and then the next I'm questioning all my life choices.
I'm Lo Mansfield, your host of the Lo and Behold podcast. Mama of 4 littles, former labor and postpartum RN, CLC, and your new best friend in the messy middle space of all the choices you are making in pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. If there is one thing I know after years of delivering babies at the bedside and then having and now raising those 4 of my own, it is that there is no such thing as a best way to do any of this. And we're leaning into that truth here. With a mix of real life and what the textbook says, expert insights, and practical applications, each week we're making our way towards stories that we participate in, stories that we are honest about, and stories that are ours. This is the Lo and Behold podcast.
When I am on my Instagram, one of my favorite questions to ask, like throw a question up in stories and just get the responses is, describe what labor pain feels like, or describe what, the pain of labor and birth feels like. Because I am telling you, the number and range of responses that you will get, ones that make you laugh, that make you cringe, that make you tighten up your pelvic floor muscles because you remember, or it, triggers some sort of memory for you. There is just this plethora of answers. One of my favorites was from a friend, Alyssa. I actually went to college with her. And she said that the pain of contractions essentially felt like a bowling ball was falling out of her butthole. And I have never forgotten that feeling, because she's not wrong in that the pressure that you feel at that moment in time, kind of end of labor, pushing all of that, it is something else. But I wanted to talk to you guys today about labor pain, and specifically the idea of pain-free birth and what we're supposed to do with that, and how we're supposed to hold that, and what we're supposed to think about it when it's brought up on social media, or maybe we see educators talking about it, or maybe your best friend tells you, hey, my birth was pain-free, whatever it is, however that is presented to you. I think it can cause and trigger a lot of feelings, maybe hope, maybe anger, frustration, confusion. And so I wanted to kind of lean into that and talk about what that phrase means to you, what I personally think it means, and then kind of how you can, walk forward with whatever you understand after we finish chatting today. In general, I do feel like that there is the possibility that those who talk and teach about pain-free birth, and not necessarily a specific person is doing this, but the way that we interpret the pain-free birth, especially if we've never experienced it, or if it were our goal and it didn't happen, is that it often can be made to make us feel like we somehow did something wrong if pain-free birth was our goal and we then experienced pain. There's this mentality or this idea that I wasn't strong enough, I wasn't in charge of myself enough, regardless of how your labor or birth went, that you still think somehow I have failed. And that is not universally true for all of us. And I am not saying that all pain-free birth educators make you think if you experience pain, you're a failure. That's not true at all. But I think sometimes those two go hand in hand. And so when you're chasing that, when you're pursuing pain-free birth and you don't achieve it, maybe even in the presence of an unmedicated birth, or, quote unquote, a beautiful birth that otherwise you thought was perfection. But if you had felt pain, then you somehow think that you have failed. And so I kind of want to get right at that right away and say it's absolutely universally, unilaterally, that is not true. I do not think any pain-free birther would teach that, should teach that. And it also is just simply not true. Experiencing pain in labor does not indicate failure in any way, shape, or form. And obviously, as you're listening to this, that the universal or more common majority opinion is that, heck yeah, I experienced pain in labor every single time. And so kind of holding that, but also knowing that there are people who teach this pain-free birth and who believe you can achieve it as well. I think it's important to kind of dig into those and try to figure out what's going on both ends of the spectrum, and then figure out where you can land and how you feel about it. So I will tell you right away, that I believe that pain-free birth is real and that people aren't, cuckoo if they're teaching this. That it doesn't just happen supernaturally, that it's not something that only is available to certain people, that it is something that can be achieved. Will I tell you that I had them? I did not. And we will get into that more. Not even close, wasn't a goal. But again, we will talk about that later. But I don't think it's this cuckoo thing. I want you to hear that. So if it is your goal, I hope that what I'm telling you next and what I'm sharing next can help you achieve that or understand how it's possible. If it is not your goal, great. Then I have a ton in here for you too, because we are going to discuss all of it. I think when we start this conversation, one of the first things to do is just get at pain, understanding pain at more of a chemical or physiological level, what's going on in the body. I like to look at pain, whether it be in labor or not, honestly, as coming kind of from two ways. We have biological factors related to pain, which are physical causes of pain, right? Like the actual things going on in the body. So if we're talking about labor specifically, we're talking about, the pressure you're feeling, the uterine contraction that's happening in that uterine muscle, the stretching of the cervix or the birth canal, baby's head literally pushing on your spine. Those are biological, those are physical causes of pain. And yes, they hit nerves and things and signals to the brain. And we have this whole process going on that says, hey, I'm hurting. And the brain's talking to your body from what it's experiencing, and you feel pain. The other factor that I think goes into this is psychological factors related to pain. So we're talking about mental and emotional perceptions of pain here. And this is more about your mind. So maybe this includes things like fear of pain or anxiety over what's happening, confusion about what the body is doing, and how all of those things can play into pain as well. The other thing that I think that's really valuable in this conversation is the fear, tension, pain cycle. And that is something that really explains the interplay between these two factors that I just talked about, the biological and then that psychological. So body and kind of mind heart connection. So the fear, tension, pain cycle, and I'm going to use labor examples while I explain this, essentially is this idea that the more fear that you have, the more pain you will feel. And I saw a post on Instagram a while ago and it ruffled a lot of feathers. And if we're being honest, I didn't love the way it read as well, but a lot of posts are just meant to be like clickbait, get you to read and learn more. So I've done that as well. So I'm guilty of that. But the post, the initial phrase on the initial slide of the post said, labor isn't painful, you're just scared. And again, while I don't love that vocabulary and the way that was presented, what it's talking about, what this post is leaning into is this fear, tension, pain cycle, that idea that fear increases pain. So essentially, this cycle tells us that, let's say we're scared about labor pain, right? And yes, I've been there. What's it going to feel like? I don't want to do this again. It's feeling worse. It's getting harder. I have absolutely experienced all of these things in my births. And so essentially what happens is as we are fearful, it creates tension in our bodies, right? We start to clench our fists, we clench our jaw, we hold our shoulders really tight. We're doing these things that kind of cause our body to lock up, right? So our mind, what we think, what we are fearful of is impacting what's going on physically, right? And so you can see how this fear can lead to tension. Now, the problem here, what comes next is that tension can actually increase pain. So if we go back to, that uterine contraction example, I'm scared of what I'm going to feel. I tense up and I'm nervous, waiting for, this next contraction. When that contraction hits, the tension that I'm holding in my body actually is going to cause me to experience that contraction more painfully because of the tension I'm holding in my body. This is why, at a very, foundational level, why it's so much of labor advice specific to pain is relax, relax your jaw, release your hands, drop your shoulders. We're trying to get rid of tension because it actually then means you will experience less pain. So let's go back. When we are holding all that tension, we hit that contraction. It is painful and it is possibly more painful because we were so tense and nervous and scared headed into it. So the pain has increased or it is bigger than maybe the prior contraction. And all of a sudden we're stuck in this cycle and our brain's telling us, I knew it. I knew that was going to hurt. It was horrible. It was worse than the last one. We become more fearful of what comes next. And then you can see here's the tension again, and we're just kind of tumbling over, right? And so the goal in labor, whether or not you want it to be pain-free, but certainly if that is the goal, is you've got to stop this cycle, right? And that cycle actually starts with those kind of psychological inputs of pain, which are the mind, the heart, what your brain is telling your body about the pain. So all of that, I think, is really fundamental or crucial to understanding labor pain. And then what we do with that is we step into that and go, okay, now, where do I land in this spectrum? How do I think I can navigate this? How do I think I can kind of step into this and handle my own labor pain? So let's go into this pain free birth topic specifically. So we have that knowledge, this understanding of what pain is. And now we answer the question, is pain free birth truly, truly real? And I think it's helpful to know what we just talked about because you can see, I think, if you're being open about this, that man, if someone has just this incredible control over their mind, it is possible that that mind can be so powerful and so strong that it can interrupt this cycle so completely that you can almost truly kind of close the gates between what your brain is telling you and what your body is experiencing. Because we cannot stop what is going on physically, right? Like your uterine muscle in labor is going to contract. You cannot stop that. It is necessary, it is important, it is what we need it to do. But can we kind of step in the middle of the signals and the things that are going on between mind and body and experience pain free birth? So, like I said, right when we started, I actually think you can. I think it is incredibly challenging. I think it is something that requires like a lot of skill and practice. Hypnobirthing, I know, leans into this so much of this massive, specific, intense control over your mind. But I do think that for some, their psychological control over what they're feeling physically is big enough to override the experience of, that quote unquote typical experience of pain during labor. And it is proven, we have research or things that show us kind of that look at all these connections that I'm talking about that show us that control over your mind does decrease the labor pain experience. And again, going back to what I said, I think you can see how these systems work together, how in theory you can get in the middle of them and stop that pain. And that specific kind of pathway that I'm talking about, or that ability to kind of interject yourself or control into this process, it's about the central nervous system control. There's this acronym CNSC. And basically what it's saying is that control over your mind and what you are thinking can directly impact the pain you do or don't feel. And then some have experienced this like ultimate central nervous system control over their labor pain. Okay, so let's talk about how they might do that. And obviously, you've already picked up on I'm saying how they might do that because, again, this is not something that I experienced, but I do believe it's possible and real. And so, again, I want to share the ways that people are navigating this and kind of chasing that goal if that is what your goal is as well. Okay, so how can we potentially experience pain free labor? And if anything, experience less pain. So, childbirth education classes, this is just a proven strategy that essentially education, good education, comprehensive education is going to decrease fear, right? And so, as soon as we know that, your brain's going to go, oh, that fear, tension, pain cycle. If I decrease my fear headed into labor, then I am going to experience less pain. And that's just true. That fear, tension, pain cycle is real. Less fear, less tension, less pain. However, I think it's also important to know that I think fear, like healthy fear headed into labor, there's nothing wrong with that. I think there is a way to hold fear and look at it and go, there are some things about labor that are unknown. That's hard for me to sit with, but it also doesn't mean I'm going to walk into this fearful, tense, unable to kind of process, manage, and move through some of the things that I know are coming or that might be coming. So I don't think the goal is total fear elimination. Perhaps someone who's really chasing pain-free birth would say that is the goal, that we are not going to feel any fear at all. But in general, back to my initial point, is that childbirth education can kind of get at the heart of that fear, diminish it, and then we see the subsequent value of that, right? You're talking about increased knowledge, calm, peace, control sitting right there next to maybe fear that you prior held. So that's why education is just so incredibly important and really should be first step for any of us. Okay, another thing, I mentioned this once already, but is practices like hypnobirthing or hypnobabies. And so much of those are about this very intense, powerful control over your mind, which we don't need to go over that again. You already know, it just has this massive trickle down effect. Aromatherapy, music, relaxation and deep breathing, touch and massage, all of those are on the list as well. Those are a lot of those other kind of basic comfort measures that you see a lot in just the unmedicated birth conversation, right? All of these are shown to create safety, create calm, create peace, which you know now is that psychological control. We're hitting that. And when we do that, then we have less tension, less pain. And so you can see how so much of this is really getting at that psychological control. Some of it, maybe touch, massage, counter pressure, things like that, you're hitting at like physical pain factors and inputs as well. But so much of this really is about the mind and then how the mind will communicate with or work with the body. Okay, so that is kind of, in my opinion, this kind of broad understanding of pain-free birth. Is it real? What does that mean? What are people talking about? How are they going to chase it? The next thing I actually want to talk about is pain tolerance and why I personally feel like why your pain tolerance has nothing to do with how you will handle labor. And I think this is valuable for those who are pursuing pain-free birth and those who are just having a baby in general. So if that's you as well, listen up. I do not care if you have a low pain tolerance in life. I do not care if a paper cut sends you reeling, if a bee sting makes you weep. None of that, in my opinion, has any reflection on how you will handle labor pain. And I want you to hear that because I think a lot of times we make assumptions about ourselves and what we are capable of before we've ever even felt the first contraction. And I think we're doing ourselves a huge disservice when we do that because the way that we show up in labor is not, in my opinion, predictable. That's why I think people can learn and that they can take classes and actually then say, oh my gosh, I am surprised with myself. I actually stepped into this in a way I had no idea I would. And yes, let's say the reverse is true as well. Like, I'm not going to be dishonest about that. Sometimes maybe you are going to think, I will crush it. And for whatever reason, it surprises you in a way that you didn't expect. But ultimately, what I want you to hear is I do not think the tolerance for pain that you have in your, quote unquote, regular life is an indication of the way you are going to handle labor pain. And I want that to be encouraging, not discouraging. Okay, so leading into that a little bit more. Pain tolerance in your regular life is not an indication of labor tolerance. I say this a lot on my Instagram. We talk about this in Your Body, Your Birth course that I teach and educate inside of as well. The pain of labor contractions and the pain in your regular life, they just aren't the same thing. So what we have going on is a lot of the physical aspects. Again, I talked about those physical inputs of pain. Those are the same, right? Something's happening in your skin, in your tissue, against your body. Physically, there are similar things in regular life that might be going on and could be compared to physically things that are going on in labor. You can make that comparison. However, labor pain has intention. It has purpose. There is emotion tied to labor pain that can change your response to what you're feeling physically. So that is why we can't just compare a bee sting. Obviously, you're not going to compare a bee sting to contractions, but when I broke my leg, I did not handle it at all. So I doubt that I'll be able to handle labor pain as well. You just can't compare those two because while the physical parts could be similar, the psychological, what's going on, the emotional components of all of that, those are not the same. Okay. So that's why labor pain, pain in regular life, you cannot compare the two. Okay. That's the first point. My second point in all of this is labor pain is pain with purpose. And I kind of already hinted to that. But nearly all of the pain that we experience in life outside of childbirth, it lacks a purpose. It will feel senseless, right? You often have this like, why is this happening to me? Why did this just happen? If it's something huge, there's even broader conversations going on in your head. But essentially, there is not a good purpose or ending to that. It's something you have to deal with and bear, but there's no goodness on the other side of it except just being past whatever is going on. The pain of labor does not lack purpose, right? The reverse is actually true. And it is I would say, some of the most purposeful, if not the most purposeful pain that you may ever experience in your entire life. So even if you do not like how you feel in labor and you want it to stop, right? You want that end goal, you still have emotionally going on this conversation in your head that I'm going to meet my child today. What I'm going through right now is going to lead me to my child. And that is going to significantly impact your tolerance of what's going on. Okay, third point in this tolerance conversation, your body responds differently to labor pain than it does pain outside of labor. And I love this science. I love deep diving it inside of the course. I love when you understand this science. But this aspect of the body has these really specific responses to help you navigate and handle labor pain is why that conversation of, you know how people will say, you would never have your tooth pulled without medication. Why would you have an unmedicated birth? And that conversation ties in directly to this point because having your tooth pulled is something that, is not supposed to happen, right? Your body doesn't kick in with all these mechanisms like, today's the day we're going to pull a tooth. So here's all the ways that I'm going to help you. We need medication to walk through that because there are things going on that in theory aren't supposed to happen, right? However, in labor, there are all of these designs to encourage and help that process, right? And so we're talking about endorphins that kick in, processes that support labor. We have this interplay between all kinds of hormones that literally show up during labor when you're experiencing pain. And it's like your body saying, hey, I want to help you in this. So here are these systems to help you do this. I'm going to use the word better, but do this maybe less painfully or to help support you in this so that you feel more calm, you feel more peace, you feel more pain. What's happening in labor, it's beautiful, it's magical, it's incredibly cool to me. That's why people can achieve unmedicated birth and certainly why people can, chase after pain-free birth because these systems are at play. Not the same when you break your leg, not the same when you pull a tooth. So I cannot stand that argument comparing those two types of pain. So, third point, that. And then fourth point, that idea that anyone can handle birth better than expected. And we already talked about this, so I won't ramble about it at you again. But essentially, I just want you to hear again, don't doom yourself to a certain experience based on your history, maybe. So, whether it's your first birth and you're basing, how you're going to feel off of how you've handled pain in your life prior, or maybe it's your fourth or fifth baby and you think, gosh, the first, second, third one, absolute trash. It was so miserable. It's going to be miserable again. I just want you to hear and to see that there are these systems at play. And so it can be different and you can show up differently than maybe you thought you had or than you did prior. And essentially, going back to that idea of education being so incredibly valuable for a pain-free birth conversation, but also any labor conversation, is that right this moment, you know more than you did 10 minutes ago, and you know more than you did yesterday. So I want you to leave yourself room to surprise yourself. And I don't care if you're like, I'm getting an epidural as soon as I hit 4 centimeters or whatever. I still want you to leave yourself room to surprise yourself with how you're going to navigate this. I want you to be, gracious to that person who's walking into this labor experience. And I want you to have kind of a lot of grace for that person too and how they're going to show up because I don't think this is all written already for you. Okay. I think that there is a lot of possibilities here. You've got a big role here and that you need to leave yourself space for how this might look and how this might play out. Okay. Third big kind of overriding thing that I want to talk about in this pain conversation as well is what if you think pain-free birth is not for you? And I hope if you're someone who was listening for this part of the conversation that you haven't dropped off. You're still here, you're listening, because I think those first kind of 2 big points, some people could piece out and be like, oh Lord, is that really what she's talking about? I think labor's going to hurt. This is ridiculous. like, I don't want to hear the rest of this. So if you're still here, yay. Let's talk about what if you think pain-free isn't for you and what that means. And this specifically, maybe you think pain-free isn't for you, but unmedicated birth is for you. Maybe you think pain-free birth isn't for you, but you're like the mama I just mentioned, and you are ready for that epidural. But you also know I'm going to experience pain at some point in this whole process. Okay. I don't know where you are, but assuming that you are coming at this saying, I don't believe, or I'm not into pain free labor, or I just don't want to make that a goal. Let's talk about that. Okay. And I want to say, I know I've mentioned twice, I am not someone who experienced pain free birth or labor, that this was more me. And so we'll just be honest about that. Labor, in my opinion, is painful, was painful, has been painful. And I see all the interplays of how all these systems work, but I have gone into them, especially after experiencing it my first time. And I have said, essentially in my brain, I believe that this will be hard. I believe that I'm going to experience pain, but I can learn about ways to deal. And so that is kind of what I'm speaking to here. I personally had the goal of unmedicated births with my babies. So I was that person who said, I'm not chasing pain free birth, but I do want an unmedicated birth. And so for me, it was like, give me all the tools because I'm going to utilize them when I am hurting and try to, mitigate that or make it easier and potentially get those unmedicated birth goals. So that's kind of how I approach this. I believe labor is going to be hard. I think it is going to hurt. And I want to learn about the tools and the ways to minimize that. I think it is also totally okay to not think you can have pain-free birth and still be wildly confident. That is how I have felt walking into my births. I've seen plenty of moms and patients walk in the same way. And so I think it's totally okay to have that. That's not a diss toward anyone with different goals. It's simply something that I think is absolutely okay. You can have a little bit of fear. We've already talked about that. You can have healthy fear. You can think pain is real, and you can still be confident about all of this. No matter what your goals are, though, you just don't want to do nothing while you get ready. So even if pain-free birth is not the goal for you, maybe your goal's like mine, maybe it's something else. Regardless, even if pain-free is not the goal for you, you can't do nothing walking into this. So let's talk about some questions to ask yourself or, things that I also thought about or asked myself, ways I approached my own birth and kind of work through some ideas that you may have about pain as you just get ready to walk into your birth. I think one of the first big things to talk about, think through, maybe inside of whatever course you're pursuing, is kind of figure out some mentalities from the education you're getting is what are your expectations about pain? And obviously we're addressing a ton of these right here. What could be true, what might not be true, and then you're supposed to figure out where you're going to land, right? That's how we started this is, I want you to figure out where you're going to land after hearing this today. So what are your expectations about pain? I think it's important and valuable to think about who has shaped them. And is that someone who should have shaped them? Is there bias? Is there slant? Is there judgments related to those people or the inputs that have shaped your perceptions of pain? And then the question kind of at the end of that of do they need refining? And again, you're here, you're learning. So in my opinion, you're already refining. I don't know where you'll land, but you're already kind of molding and shaping either your expectations or what you think about pain and how you want to move forward with that. So you're already getting at this one right now, which is great. The second thing I think that is really valuable to think about and keep in the conversation is, I've already told you this, evidence is wildly clear that birth education positively impacts different outcomes in birth. Like we can tie good education, comprehensive, and in my opinion, unbiased, unslanted, non-judgmental education. It can impact really specific outcomes in birth. So I would ask you as you're prepping for your birth, how are you learning? Who are you learning from? And is it open, honest, comprehensive? Is it giving you that freedom to take in information and then decide how you want to apply it to your life? I think that's so important for birth education, is that freedom to then decide, this is what I'm going to do with what you've just taught me. So that's point two. Second thing I think is really important to think about as you walk into your labor. The third thing, I want you to understand the emotional signposts as they relate to pain, especially. They play such a specific role in your labor and your birth. I have a blog post on these as well, and I can link that in the show notes for you. But essentially, the emotional signposts of labor are these emotions that you will go through during your labor, particularly more in an unmedicated birth. And I would say also in a pain free birth, though the psychological mind control might or could be so powerful there that you don't see these on display as much. So I would bet that internally you would still be feeling them. But essentially, there are these changes in your emotions that happen along with labor stages. And I'm going to do a podcast episode about these tying together with stages so you guys can understand them at a really kind of basic level, what they mean. But emotional signposts are not this woo woo, crunchy thing. They're really, really cool. And I've actually personally experienced them. So I know that they are real. And I have seen them in my patients and my moms that I've taken care of. Looking back, too, especially because a lot of my births happened after I was a nurse at the bedside. Now I'm so much more cognizant and aware of these emotional signposts. And so I can think back to so many patients and I think, oh, she was in this point in labor. She was experiencing this signpost. This is why this was happening. And so I want you to understand the emotional signposts. Read that blog post. And when you understand them, I think the emotional changes that happen in your body as your labor progresses is not going to scare you. Those emotional signposts may even encourage you, and you will find that all of that, less fear, right, guys? Less tension, less pain. All of that is going to tie into your labor pain conversation and the way you're navigating whatever is going on. So, know those emotional signposts. You can recognize them and use them to kind of navigate what you're going through and what you're feeling during your labor, okay? And the last thing here that I want you to consider or think about, this is what I'm actually saying. Don't just hold on to this tight, okay? When it comes to labor pain and what you want to do about it, is your breasts are yours. I cannot, what is the word? I cannot say that more clearly, more directly. Your lungs in labor, and specifically to how you are navigating whatever pain you do or don't feel, are one of your most powerful tools. The way that you breathe during labor can activate specific nervous system responses, and those will drastically alter what you feel and your levels of fear. So, this is kind of going back to the very beginning of our conversation where we're talking about central nervous system control, those psychological, physical connections between pain, those inputs coming in. But it is wild how powerful your lungs and what you're doing with your own breathing patterns can get right smack in the middle of labor pain and potentially get rid of it for some of us, diminish it for others of us, bring calm, control, peace so that we can navigate whatever we are feeling. And this breath work, this power of your lungs, it is not just about unmedicated labor because you are going to want to deep breathe during postpartum, during C-section recovery, maybe the first time you have to pee. The power of your breath and what it does to your nervous system and having control over your lungs is just, I could ramble on about it forever. I will stop. I teach about it inside of Your Body, Your Birth for sure. We talk about the systems at play and how we get in the middle of all of them and how your lungs are so incredibly powerful. So just don't disregard the education around the way you breathe, the types of breathing patterns. You can practice these at home, just how it feels to breathe in certain ways, J breathing, box breathing, even those cleansing breaths, things like that. You can practice all of this. So don't skip past that part inside your birth education or your birth course, okay? I only utilize breathing as a pain control tool. Okay, I also had, presence support value. Kelvin was close by, things like that. But my breathing was the only thing essentially that you could kind of say, oh, look at that tool she's really using. And it worked for me. So I know the power of it. Okay, I'll stop. That was a lot on your breast and your lungs. But okay, you guys. So essentially, we have talked about what is pain? What are you supposed to think about it? How can you stand in the middle of it, right? We've talked about pain-free birth, whether or not it could be real, how it could be real, whether or not you think that's for you, that's up to you, right? And then pursuing that, that's also up to you. Who are you going to go to? Who's going to help you do that? Who's going to help you stand in that? And we talked about pain tolerance and how I absolutely don't think that your tolerance of pain now has any impact or should speak at all to how you're going to handle pain during labor. And then we've talked about what happens when you don't think pain-free is for you, and how are you going to kind of approach pain and start thinking about it right now as you prep and get ready for maybe the baby you're currently pregnant with, one you're going to have in the future. Ultimately, I think what I want you to hear in all of this is that the things that cause labor pain, they can be understood and explained, okay? Textbook level, I hope we just did some of that. These are systems in place, right? So that is important for you to understand that these can be understood. I also want you to hear that labor pain is different than other types of pain, and that the body has different mechanisms to step in and help you navigate it. And your power, your control, the things you have going on in labor, you can kind of help utilize those mechanisms. That was the whole rambly breath conversation and power, right? And I think another thing I really want you to hear is that we can also teach and learn ways to kind of change how we respond to what's going on in our bodies during labor. Ultimate goal of what's going on in your body during labor and how you feel, that's yours. You get to set that. I'm not going to tell you what the goal should be, but I can teach you and help you learn ways to change how you respond, what you're going to do when you are kind of presented with or you are going through the pain of labor or the sensations of labor, however your vocabulary, whatever vocabulary feels best for you when you talk about that. Ultimately, or overall, though, what we can't do and what we shouldn't do is make it seem like there is one, specific interpretation or specific experience here for all of us if we just knew the right things or we did this the right way. And that kind of trickles back to that conversation of pain-free birth and maybe pursuing it, or wondering if you should be pursuing it and feeling any sort of shame if you finish your birth and you didn't experience it the way you'd been taught or told that you would. And that's really, if I had a goal here overall, it would be to eliminate that, you taking that on as shame because you didn't interpret it or experience labor or its associated pain in the way you thought you did, and that's some sort of failure on your part. Okay, so please hear that. I know people who have had a pain-free birth. I know people who thought labor was absolutely the worst thing ever. I know people who thought labor was incredible, but it still hurt. And I know people who thought it would be awful and then were really surprised with how they showed up and they managed it. So there is just such a spectrum here. And none of those interpretations and experiences are failures or make you, wrong when you are relaying that or sharing that with someone else. That right there, that's the reality, that all of those are real. We are not the same. And so our experience, they are not the same. We are unique. So no matter what we know or how we prep, all of this is going to be wildly unique to who you are and to who I am. So we're going to teach the tools, right? We're going to teach you how to understand the process. And then we're going to keep sharing ways that you can navigate what you feel and what your body is doing. That's the goal for me here. That's the goal in my birth class. And that's why we do things like make birth plans, right? Because I want you to start seeing all the tools, all the things. I have a birth plan template as well, which is a free resource I can drop in my show notes for you as well. But essentially, that is a way we start towing into these waters, looking at the tools, and then saying, I have a toolbox now. And now I get to choose how to use these tools, not just specific to labor pain, but in the entire process and whatever goals you do or don't have for what is going to happen inside of your birth. There is just so much that you can learn and that you can understand about all of this. But at the end of the day, we are unique, right? And I know I've already said that, but I just want to end here with that. So that means that our experiences in all of this are unique, and we are designed for it to be that way. We are not built for all of us to experience this the same way. And that is why there is so much value in us sharing our stories. And that is why there is so much value in us also really taking that in, right? And really understanding that I am not intended to birth in the same way that Lo was. I am not intended to birth in the same way my sister, my mom, or my best friend did. I am intended to birth in the way my body, my mind, my heart is intended to birth. So if you take anything away from that or anything away from this today, I hope that it is that uniqueness. Thank you so much for listening to the Lo and Behold podcast. I hope there was something for you in today's episode that made you think, made you laugh, or made you feel seen. For show notes and links to the resources, freebies, or discount codes mentioned in this episode, please head over to lowandbeholdpodcast.com. If you aren't following along yet, make sure to tap subscribe or follow in your podcast app so we can keep hanging out together. And if you haven't heard it yet today, you're doing a really good job. A little reminder, opinions shared by guests of this show are their own and do not always reflect those of myself and the Labor Mama platform. Additionally, the information you hear on this podcast or that you receive via any linked resources should not be considered medical advice. Please see our full disclaimer at the link in the show notes.